So readers, today we're going to be thinking again about comparing and contrasting two stories. Let's do a quick review of comparing and contrasting. Remember, compare means how are things the same? And I often go like this because that helps me remember the same. How are things the same? Contrast, on the other hand, means how are they different? So I always take my hands and go like this because my hands are going in different directions. So compare is how they're the same and contrast is how they're different. For example, if we look at these socks, if we were to compare the socks, we would say, well, they're both socks, they're both about the same size, and they have the same shape. But we would contrast them because there are ways that they're different, right? They have different colors. The sock on this side is purple and orange, and the sock on this side is white and red. The sock on this side has circles, while the sock on this side looks like it has a bunch of squares that overlap. So that's how they're different. We can do the same work with different versions of a story. A version is just a specific form or style of something. It's kind of like this. You know the game of football. Well, the game of football has different versions. There's a flag football kind, where instead of tackling people, you have to try to rip their flag off. And there's the tackle football kind, where instead of ripping a flag off to stop the play, you have to actually tackle the person to the ground who has the football. Both are still the game of football, but they're played just a little bit differently. Or think about dance. This version of dance is called hip hop. It has loud beaty music and people move and dance. And this version is called ballet. Typically in ballet, the music is a little more smooth and they stand on one toe and they spin around often. Both are types of dance, but they're different versions of dance. Well, books can have different versions too. Think about the three stories that we've read: Cinderella, Ye Shen, and the Korean Cinderella. Each of these are considered Cinderella stories, but they're different versions of the same story. They have some things that are the same, and they have some things that are different, but they're all Cinderella stories. Today I'm going to show you how to use a graphic organizer to compare and contrast versions of the same story. Here's the graphic organizer we're going to use to jot down our thoughts. It looks a little overwhelming, but it's really simple to use and it really helps us to think through the story to compare and contrast it. First, we're going to compare and contrast the characters in the story. We do this work by first thinking, how are the characters the same? I'm going to think about the story Cinderella from Journeys and the Korean Cinderella that we just read. And I'm going to ask myself, how are the characters in Cinderella and the characters in the Korean Cinderella the same? Well, both stories had a beautiful girl. So I write beautiful girl under both because both means compare. Both is how they're the same. Both of them had a beautiful girl. Both of them had a mean stepmother. And both of them had a magical character. The type of magical character was different, but they did both have some sort of magical character in it. So I write those under both because that's in both stories. Now I want to ask myself, how are they different? And remember, I'm just thinking about characters right now. So how are the characters different in each story? First, I thought about Cinderella. Well, what's different about Cinderella? Well, in Cinderella, she has two stepsisters. But in the Korean Cinderella, she has only one stepsister. So I write that under Korean Cinderella. See how that works? I'm thinking about how they're different. Under Cinderella, I wrote two stepsisters because she only had two. Under Korean Cinderella, I wrote one stepsister because she only had one. I want to think about the magical helpers because even though they both had magical helpers, each story was a little different. In Cinderella, it was a fairy godmother. So I wrote fairy godmother under Cinderella. In the Korean Cinderella, do you remember what the magical helper was? That's right. It was a magic ox. So I write magic ox under Korean Cinderella. That's how we can think of ways that they are the same under both. And then I put the parts that are different under each of the story titles, Cinderella and Korean Cinderella. Let me show you again using the setting. Remember, first I asked myself what question? How are they the same? That's right. I put that under both. Well, for this setting, they are both the same because they both start off at home. Now, their homes looked a little bit different, but they both were at home at the beginning of the story, and that's pretty much the only way these settings were the same. So now I want to contrast them. How are they different? What was in Cinderella that was not in Korean Cinderella, and what was in this Korean Cinderella that was not in the other Cinderella? So in Cinderella from Journeys, her home was a house, wasn't it? But in the Korean Cinderella, it was a cave. Notice how I wrote house under Cinderella and cave under the Korean Cinderella. How else was the setting different? Well, in Cinderella, she went to a castle, but in the Korean Cinderella, she didn't go to a castle, did she? Where did she go? She went to the festival. So I wrote that under Korean Cinderella. So do you see how we can think, how are they the same? And we write it under both. We think, how are they different? And we write it under the title, Cinderella or Korean Cinderella. I want you to practice. The next two Nearpod slides are going to be the bottom part of this organizer. It's really hard to write so tiny, so I'm going to do problem on one Draw It slide, and I'm going to do solution on the other Draw It slide. I want you to compare and contrast Cinderella and the Korean Cinderella. How is the problem the same? And how is each of the problems different? And then same for the solution. The way the problem is solved, how is it the same? How is it different? You're going to jot your thoughts on the Draw It slide, and then we'll see if you're right.